For the growing leftist political factions of the time, the year 1968 seemed to be a breaking point. With the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., as well as U.S. military escalation in Vietnam with the Tet Offensive, the peaceful measures taken by the civil rights and anti war movements started to fall on deaf ears. Influenced by works like Herbert Marcuse's Repressive Tolerance, many counterculture activists felt that trying to reform a system of overarching oppression was ineffective and that it was merely working inside the institutions of said bigotry, and that such forms of resistance were easy to co-opt as a result. Student activists, who were known for previously staging pacifist demonstrations against the Vietnam War, began to take on a more confrontational attitude, as seen in several groups occupying buildings at Columbia University in protest against the institution's connection to Defense Department research. Perhaps more poignant was the rise of several organizations of color, like the African American Black Panthers or the Puerto Rican Young Lords, who preached a form of socialism that seemed radical to white America. Rather than follow the reforming footsteps of civil rights pinnacles like the Congress of Racial Equality or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, these groups pledged a type of nationalism that directly celebrated their culture and focused on outreach programs for inner city communities that grew from the local area itself, such as free breakfast programs or lessons in self-defense. Some of the purposefully outrageous elements of the new Black Power movement, such as the black exclusive membership of the Panthers, proved to become a controversial wedge for the Students for a Democratic Society, a nationwide activist group that recruited and organized demonstrations across American college campuses. For an older faction, the Progressive Labor Party, the nationalism of these organizations was seen as too divisive to the prospect of a united proletarian class. In contrast, however, was a younger part of SDS called the Revolutionary Youth Movement, otherwise known as RIM, that adamantly supported black nationalism as an appropriate method of combating American systemic racism. Tensions came to a blow at the June 1969 conference for SDS, where Bernardine Dohrn, a leader of the organization's RIM faction, led a mass of members in walking out on progressive labor after deeming them to be counter-revolutionary. As the infighting effectively dissolved SDS, members of RIM decided to start their own splinter group with the publication of a manifesto taken from a Bob Dylan lyric called "You Don't Need a Weatherman to Know the Way the Wind Blows." In it, the newly formed Weathermen argued that the imperialism and institutionalized racism of the United States was the most oppressive system in the world, and that in order to combat it, communities of color and youth around the globe must launch their own means of national liberation. Such ideas would become the central ethos of the socialist group, with the group strongly lending support and awareness to racial strife and anti-imperialist struggles in the Third World, while failing to connect with their own domestic working class due to internal barriers of privilege. In the eyes of the document's authors, which included activists like Bernardine Dohrn, Mark Rudd, and John Jacobs, nationalism could be weaponized in a cooperative way to properly combat American imperialism. Viewing the bigotry and regime change of the power as the greatest example of hegemony in the modern world, Weather took to promoting self-determination movements of various minorities, namely the North Vietnamese and Black Americans, as an adequate anti-imperialist force. Ideally, national liberation movements across the Third World and among racial minorities in the United States would constantly stay in contact with each other for the proper overthrow of a capitalist world order. These ideas were heavily informed by the thought of Che Guevara and René Debré's Revolution in the Revolution, which felt that revolution must constantly change and be in contact with other revolutions in order to remain effective. In line with this principle, a delegation of weathermen that were led by Dohrn visited the Republic of Cuba in July of 1969 to speak to the North Vietnamese, where they received military training. Indeed, militancy was preferred by Weather in its beginning as the appropriate way of combating capitalism and imperialism at home. Nevertheless, this was not rooted in any bloodlust or a deep want of violence, but rather out of genuine belief among members that revolution was imminent and that drastic action was necessary in this context. In commitment to anti-racism, Weather also respected the racially exclusive nature of groups like the Black Panthers and Young Lords, and decided on having all-white membership in their organization. Still, this was not done out of any personal nationalism, but rather to position themselves as strictly white allies of movements including Black Power and Vietnamese liberation. As most members of Weather came from privileged upper class backgrounds, they saw the front they were propping up as one of a sole alliance, and took to viewing the white American working class as too imbued with imperialist narratives to be empowered. This often turned to directly alienating domestic workers, as seen in the young activists once dismissing a strike among General Electric employees because of the company's involvement in the Vietnam War. Rather than coveting alliances with local workers around the country, as the old left would, the Weathermen tried a new approach by appealing to elements of youth culture at the time. This included members often engaging in recreational drug use and promiscuous sex, as well as organizing the jailbreak of psychedelic guru Timothy Leary and organizing the hippie figure's escape to Algeria. These practices were deeply rooted in the sensibilities of the era's counterculture, where young activists often bonded on these unorthodox beliefs as a sign of rebellion against more conservative American social standards of the time. While seeming to be a type of liberation, members like David Gilbert came to regret these activities as deeply unserious and somewhat individualist, as it fulfilled one's personal desires rather than working towards a collective goal. Another facet of the counterculture that Weather appealed to was the women's liberation movement, with many female members feeling empowered by the act of partaking in revolution. Unlike earlier civil rights and anti-war organizations, where women faced internal issues of sexism relating to the subordination of men, in Weather they often took on leadership positions. People such as Bernadine Dorn and Diane Oughton took on principal roles in furthering the group's agenda, such as personally conducting communications with the North Vietnamese or organizing collectives in Michigan. The type of feminism that women in Weather closely identified with was second wave feminism, since they focused on achieving gender equality beyond the political realm, and promoted intersectionality, seeing how racial or class backgrounds can contribute to more oppression for particular women. Female solidarity was displayed in events like Mountain Moving Day, where study groups were arranged to look to the ties of sexism, imperialism, and racism. Still, women in this organization sought cooperation between genders over any dominance, with the Weather Bureau being made up of both men and women to promote personal autonomy, and eventually switching to the name Weather Underground rather than Weathermen in order to avoid gender bias. There was an active initiation to root out misogyny from the group, as seen in men being criticized for perceived objectification of women with free love, so that equality in political activism could blossom. In order to remain truly underground, the Weathermen sought out a lifestyle of self-imposed exile. The group itself was physically divided into several collectives spread out across American cities and university towns, often centering on a singular member's house or apartment. As most Weathermen could not hold down full-time jobs because of their political activity, many subsisted on lesser means, including trust funds from their wealthy parents or selling drugs. Higher-ranking members, such as Jeff Jones, often had to lead even more solitary means, receiving fraudulent IDs to remain hidden, as collectives often faced break-ins and raids from local police. In order to properly vet members and initiate them into fully joining the Weather Underground, leaders of the organization's divisions arranged self-criticism sessions where participants, at times under the influence of psychedelic drugs, had to reckon with an array of personal flaws related to any particular kind of behavior, as seen in members being lambasted for being either too cowardly or too arrogant. While this activity was thought to be a liberating experience of self-improvement, for many it proved to be a deeply stressful one, where one felt alienated from an ideally supportive community. An audience that the Weather Underground consistently coveted were white working-class youth that were local to the surrounding area of each collective. The attempts to build an alliance at times were blatantly obvious, with members organizing jailbreaks for juvenile delinquents that often ended with lectures on the world's injustices of the time, namely the Vietnam War. Much of the effort to facilitate support from this base proved unsuccessful and self-defeating, as seen in the Detroit collective being personally attacked by working-class youth, and the only government informant of the organization, Larry Grathwall, being recruited in Cincinnati because of his appearance as a disaffected and impoverished veteran. Ironically, despite attempting to be aware of their personal privilege, the Weathermen looked at the working class of the United States with a paternalistic lens, expecting the base to take on the brutish task of physical violence, and not understanding how they could feel dismissed by the group's patronizing rhetoric as a force of revolution. In its early stages, the Weather Underground held violence in optimistic esteem, finding that it was a way of being real, in that it posed a genuine, tangible threat to a system of oppression. This form of resistance among weathermen began in Chicago in October of 1969, where, after bombing a statue dedicated to local police that crushed striking workers in the Haymarket affair, members began running through and damaging property in the city's wealthy Gold Coast neighborhood. The primary target of this attack was the home of Judge Julius Hoffman, who oversaw and persecuted prominent hippie and Black Panther leaders in the trial of the Chicago Seven, which took place after demonstrations of the 1968 Democratic Convention. While this retrospectively appeared to be a minor incident in terms of full force, at the time the weathermen saw it as a massive one of uprising, with participants appearing visibly shaken in moments, and member Susan Stern thinking that it could amount to something so earth-shattering in America that the American masses would finally take notice. In order to further this revolutionary struggle, the activists that led what would later be called the Days of Rage announced themselves as Marion Delgado, a young American boy who lied in front of train tracks decades prior as a sign of solidarity. The revolutionary elements intended by the group did not spread to the surrounding counterculture, as working-class businesses were damaged in the attacks, and Black Panther Fred Hampton dismissed them as needlessly antagonizing to the general public. Although the Days of Rage were non-lethal, with weathermen carrying no weapons and only inducing minor bruises on passerbys, local police and the National Guard responded with brutal force, harshly maiming or shooting at protesters. In perhaps the most severe incident, legislator Richard Elrod attempted to tackle weatherman Brian Flanagan, only to be trampled by police officers and be paralyzed from the neck down as a result of injuries. Following the Days of Rage, the organization viewed it as a successful opening for violent direct action, coming up with improvements in a self-criticism session and promising more effective violence in order to encounter the force of authorities. The group's infatuation with terrorism quickly sizzled out in a grisly way when, on March 6, 1970, members Diane Otten, Ted Gold, and Terry Robbins died while constructing a pipe bomb at a townhouse in New York City's Greenwich Village neighborhood. It was intended for a soldier's dance at the U.S. military's Fort Dix, but after it mishapped and destroyed the home, survivors of the failed project quickly fled the scene and went into hiding afterward. The fatal explosion came at a time of intense political violence in America, where the country was rocked by campus demonstrations and minor bombings in protest of the Vietnam War. In what seemed like an appropriate response to the state-sponsored oppression of these social movements, Weather leader Bernardine Dohrn officially declared war on the United States in a recorded message dated on May 21, 1970, as a sign of solidarity with the Black Panthers and the North Vietnamese, with the group bombing the headquarters of the NYPD a week later and incurring minor damage on the building. Despite the bluster of the rhetoric, the loss of key organizers and friends in the Greenwich Village townhouse explosion was devastating for the Weather Underground, and it matured them into a sobering reality that was aware of the tragedies involved in political violence. Indeed, the organization was highly concerned and aware of death during its inaugural months, with frequent comparisons between the Vietnam War and the Holocaust, and leaders personally feeling the need to sacrifice themselves in solidarity with the oppressed of the Third World. After non-lethally bombing Marin County courthouses to protest the harsh sentence of political prisoner George Jackson, Weather pledged to a more introspective direction with the publication of a manifesto called New Morning. Drafted during a group retreat on Long Island in December of 1970, it promised to practice direct action that was purposefully nonviolent and peaceful. The document's authors remained true to the word, as their bombings never killed non-members and only caused minor injuries such as cuts and burns to bystanders. Although this system of oppression, Weather sought to dismantle, would respond with a force that was covert and lethal. As the counterculture was beginning to burgeon, the Federal Bureau of Investigation for the United States government was experimenting with a secretive way of suppressing both far-left and far-right resistance. Termed the Counterintelligence Program COINTELPRO, this initiative featured intense measures of government surveillance, including disguising mass arrests of activists as drug busts with lengthy prison sentences, or tapping the telephones of targeted individuals. The central purpose of this spying was to sow division and paranoia among extremist groups that aimed to unify themselves, as seen in the agency sending in Black Panther informants that wrongly accused white cohorts of racism, or having infiltrators into groups like the Ku Klux Klan encouraging racist bombings of black churches. COINTELPRO reached the Weather Underground with the work of one informant, Larry Grathwohl, who gave intelligence about several collectives and arranged for the arrest of several figures conspiring to build a bomb. The mass shutdown of the group, along with the more open oppression of student demonstrators with the deadly Kent State and Augusta, Georgia shootings, sent a shockwave for many of its people, with membership dropping from a few hundred to a couple dozen. Nevertheless, the most violent forms of government surveillance were reserved for groups of color, like the Black Panthers, with the most egregious example being the police sedation and killing of peaceful community organizer Fred Hampton. While authority figures like J. Edgar Hoover referred to the Weather Underground as the most violent, persistent, and pernicious of revolutionary groups, the tactics they used against the group were noticeably tamer. Throughout the early 70s, the Weathermen maintained a public presence in the American eye through a series of low-level bombings. Targets of these attacks were primarily related to the American government and major corporations that profited from its actions, with the group launching minor detonations of the Capitol building, the Pentagon, ITT headquarters, and the offices of Gulf Oil. For the Weathermen, the importance of these actions did not come from their full blast, but rather from the educational statements they represented. This came in the form of communiques attached to the bombs, which often explained the rationale of the attacks to the public by providing key information of the issues at hand, such as the Capitol bombing being due to President Richard Nixon's illegal extension of the Vietnam War into Cambodia, and the property of Anaconda Copper being attacked due to the profit they drew from the U.S.-backed coup of Salvador Allende, the democratically elected president of Chile. The motives outlined in all these messages were compiled in full length in Prairie Fire, The Politics of Revolutionary Anti-Imperialism, published in 1974 and written and revised by all the group's members in a workshop known as Red Dragon Print. The anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist messages were further expanded in Osawatomie, a magazine published by the group that same year, which was named after the Kansas town where abolitionist John Brown was active. These writings by the Weather Underground helped continue an important tradition of the counterculture as it grew insular, which involved the positioning of niche publications like the Berkeley Tribe as liaisons among leftist communities, where an oppressive mainstream could be avoided and awareness of issues affecting disenfranchised groups could be spread. This move helped the Weathermen gain important connections, receiving an uptick in donations, and giving them a more professional image in the web of far-left political groups. The group spread their ideas in other media formats as well, most notably in the 1976 film Underground, where members anonymously explained their view of the United States being the major form of oppression in the world, with its regime change in other countries being drawn by its profit incentive. During this time, the Weathermen began to disintegrate within a gradual process of offshoots and minor fractures, with President Richard Nixon announcing the 1973 peace treaty in Vietnam and the fall of the American-backed regime there 2 years later. The organization was without a focal point that could drive its actions, and since they did not have a strong base among the domestic working class, they were left without direction. While still displaying solidarity with oppressed groups, as seen in organizing strikes or protecting black families facing violence from Boston communities opposed to bushing, an overarching agenda for where the group should head was undecided. This led to significant fissures growing, as seen in the East Coast wing of the Weathermen forming the Prairie Fire Organizing Committee, where original members like Bernadine Dorn and Bill Ayers were open to criticisms of how to incorporate politics of class struggle into their platform. Meanwhile, a splinter group rose up in Weather's division with the Bay Area, called the Revolutionary Committee and headed by old left communist Clayton von Leidengraf. The splinter group sought to return to the political violence present in Weather's beginnings, but were baited by FBI infiltrators early on and arrested for the plan to bomb the home of homophobic Senator John Briggs. With the West Coast wing effectively crushed and its eastern counterpart growingly split as participants joined larger groups like the May 19th organization, Weather was effectively defunct by 1976. In the ensuing years, the once underground activists gradually turned themselves into police, receiving minimal prison sentences for their actions due to the FBI's illegal surveillance, with many leading quiet lives as professors and teachers afterward. Although its history has been obscured by that of the wider counterculture, the story and the fate of the Weather Underground serves as an interesting microcosm for the sensibilities of the New Left and its faults. Fittingly, members of the organization have embodied a stereotype that has plagued political entertainment since, that of the amateur revolutionary or the champagne socialist, who wishes to break apart systems of oppression and liberate its victims, but is too ignorant of their own privileged status to achieve success. While well versed in issues of third world exploitation and institutional racism, the Weathermen were never able to truly reckon with their own upper class background in a way that could better connect them to a disenfranchised audience. This was most apparent in the group's self-stylization of themselves as white allies, where both communities of color and the white working class felt dismissed by rhetoric that spoke of the need for said friendship or deemed the group as oppressors, respectively. Indeed, the Weathermen receiving light consequences displayed how they were products of the power structures they wanted to dismantle, eventually folding into social conformity and concrete hopes of change, bearing little fruit.